What kind of man lives like a beggar but dies like a king? Stay with us because the day a poor village boy attended the funeral of the homeless old man he once saved. Wealthy strangers arrived in black cars and called him something that changed his life forever. Your father. The first time David saw the old man, rain was falling so hard that even the street dogs had disappeared. Lagos rain was different from village rain. In the village, rain smelled of soil and cassava leaves and the slow comfort of home. But Lagos rain smelled of blocked gutters, petrol, and desperation. It turned the streets into rivers and people into survivors. David was 23 years old and exhausted. For 2 years, he had lived in Ajagunle inside a one-room shack with a leaking zinc roof and walls thin enough to hear your neighbor cry at night. He worked at a mechanic workshop during the day and unloaded rice trucks at night whenever extra money was needed, which was always. He had not come to Lagos chasing wealth. He had come because after his mother died, there was nothing left in the village except a crumbling mud house and memories heavy enough to suffocate him. That evening, he was returning from work soaked to the bone when he noticed the old man sitting beneath a broken kiosk near the roadside. At first glance, the man looked like every forgotten soul Lagos had swallowed and spat back out. Dirty gray beard, torn clothes, plastic sandals barely hanging together, his body thin with the kind of hunger that settles permanently into the bones. Cars splashed muddy water around him as they passed. Nobody looked at him. But something about the old man's eyes made David stop walking. They were not empty eyes. They were watching eyes, sharp, alert, the eyes of someone who had once been important enough to command rooms. The old man looked up. Slowly, young man, he said softly, "Do you know where I can find food around here?" David checked his pocket instinctively. 200 naira. That was all he had left until morning. He stared at the money for a moment, then sighed. "Come," he said quietly. The old man followed him through the rain to a roadside buka still open despite the weather. David bought 2 plates of rice and stew. With the last money he had, the woman serving them looked annoyed. "You're feeding street people now," she muttered. David ignored her. The old man ate slowly, carefully, like a man trying not to embarrass himself with hunger. "What's your name?" David asked. The man paused before answering. "Elijah." Just Elijah. No surname. No explanation. When they finished eating, the rain had become worse. David looked toward the dark street, then back at the old man's trembling hands. "You can sleep in my room tonight," he said. The old man's eyes lifted slowly, and for the first time David saw faintly of engine oil and damp clothes. Elijah sat quietly on the thin mattress while David changed into dry clothes behind a curtain. "You trust people too easily," Elijah said suddenly. David laughed softly. "Nobody who knows Lagos says that. But it's true." David shrugged. "Maybe." Elijah looked around the tiny room carefully. A kettle, 2 plastic chairs, a Bible with worn pages beside the bed, 1 framed photograph of David and his late mother. "You had a mother who loved you," Elijah said quietly. David's smile faded. "She died 3 years ago." Elijah nodded slowly as though filing the information somewhere deep inside himself. That night David slept on the floor while Elijah took the mattress. In the morning the old man was gone, but beside the kettle sat 5,000 naira. David stared at it in confusion. No homeless man carried 5,000 naira. Something about the entire thing felt strange. Still, life in Lagos moved too fast for mystery. He went back to work. 3 days later he saw Elijah again, this time near the mechanic workshop. The old man was sitting beneath a mango tree while boys nearby mocked him openly. "Mad old man. See village grandfather." One of them threw pure water sachets at him. David crossed the road immediately. "Leave him alone." The boys laughed and disappeared. Elijah looked up calmly. "You came again?" "You shouldn't stay around here," David said. "These boys are stupid." Elijah studied him quietly. "Why do you care?" David frowned. "What kind of question is that?" The old man smiled faintly. That became the beginning. Days turned into weeks. Sometimes David would find Elijah near the workshop, sometimes near the roadside church, sometimes sitting quietly outside a closed pharmacy, watching people pass, and every single time David helped him. Food, water, conversation. Once he even used part of his salary to buy the old man proper sandals. "You're wasting money on me," Elijah had said. David shook his head. Nobody is a waste. The old man stared at him for a very long time after that. Then one evening, everything changed. David returned home late and found Elijah sitting outside his shack waiting for him. But something was wrong. The old man looked weaker than usual, his breathing uneven. "Elijah?" The man smiled weakly. "I think my body is tired." David rushed him to a small private clinic nearby using borrowed transport money. The doctor examined Elijah quietly before pulling David aside. "He needs proper hospital treatment," he said softly. "His organs are failing." "How much?" The doctor hesitated. David already knew it would be too much. And it was. Far too much. That night, David sat beside Elijah's bed listening to the old man breathe through pain. "You should go home," Elijah whispered. David shook his head. "You'll be all right." A faint smile appeared on the old man's lips. "You sound like my wife used to." David froze slightly. It was the first personal thing Elijah had ever revealed. "You had a wife?" Elijah closed his eyes. "A long time ago. What happened to her?" But the old man never answered. Because by morning, Elijah was dead. The clinic called. David first, because he was the only contact the old man had left behind. David stood beside the covered body in silence, feeling grief heavier than he expected. How do you mourn someone you barely knew? And why did it feel like he had just lost family? The clinic administrator handed him a small envelope. "He asked us to give you this if anything happened." David opened it carefully. Inside was a short handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me that good people still exist." And beneath the note, a key, with an address written underneath. Banana Island. David stared at it in disbelief. Banana Island, one of the richest places in Lagos. Nothing about Elijah made sense anymore. 3 days later, David attended the funeral arranged quietly by the clinic and a local church. He expected almost nobody to come. Instead, black SUVs began arriving one after another. Men in expensive suits stepped out, women wearing dark designer sunglasses, security escorts. Even the pastor looked confused. David stood frozen beside the grave as whispers spread through the crowd. Then an elderly man approached him slowly, tall, gray-haired, expensive wristwatch gleaming beneath the sunlight. The man stopped directly before David, and with trembling eyes he asked softly, "Are you the young man who stayed with Chief Gabriel Adebayo before he died?" David blinked. "Who?" The man's face tightened emotionally. "Chief Gabriel Adebayo," he repeated. "Your father." And suddenly, the entire funeral went silent. The words struck David so hard that for a moment, the world around him seemed to disappear. Your father. Not Elijah. Not the homeless old man. Chief Gabriel Adebayo. David stared at the wealthy stranger in confusion. "You're mistaken." The older man looked heartbroken. "No," he said quietly. "I don't think I am." Murmurs spread through the funeral crowd like wildfire. David looked around and realized something terrifying. These people were not confused. They knew exactly who Elijah had been. Or rather, who he used to be. The elderly man introduced himself as Barrister Tunda Balogun, Chief Adebayo's longtime lawyer and friend of over 30 years. "The man you knew as Elijah," he said carefully, "was once one of the wealthiest businessmen in this country." David almost laughed. The statement sounded insane. The old man who slept beneath kiosks? Who wore torn clothes and begged for food? Impossible. But Barrister Tunda continued calmly. Chief Gabriel Adebayo owned shipping companies, real estate, oil contracts. At one point, he was richer than most politicians. David's chest tightened. Then why was he living on the street? The lawyer's expression darkened. Because 15 years ago, his family destroyed him. The funeral guests stood quietly listening now. Some looked ashamed. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Barrister Tunde explained everything slowly. After the death of Chief Adebayo's wife, the family began fighting over his wealth. His younger brother partnered, secretly with corrupt business, associates and manipulated legal documents while the chief struggled with depression and alcoholism after his wife's death. Then came betrayal, fake psychiatric reports, forged signatures, control of company accounts. Within 2 years, Chief Adebayo had lost almost everything. Not legally, strategically. His enemies didn't want him dead. They wanted him erased. And eventually, he disappeared. Most people assumed he had died abroad. But Barrister Tunda never stopped searching, until 3 weeks earlier, when he contacted me, the lawyer said softly. He told me he was finally ready to come home. David swallowed hard. Why now? The lawyer looked directly into his eyes. Because he said he finally found someone worth leaving his name to. Silence, heavy silence. David felt suddenly unable to breathe properly. No, he whispered. I barely knew him. Barrister Tunde reached into his briefcase slowly, then handed David a thick brown envelope. Inside were photographs, old photographs. A younger Gabriel Adebayo smiling beside a woman David recognized instantly. His mother. David's knees nearly gave way. Another photograph slipped out. A hospital bracelet. A birth certificate. His birth certificate. Father's name. Gabriel Adebayo. The world stopped. His mother had never told him. Not once. Not even before she died. David's hands trembled violently as memories crashed through him. The nights his mother cried quietly after thinking he had slept. The way she always refused to speak about his father. The bitterness in her silence whenever he asked. She left Lagos before you were born, Barrister Tunde explained gently. After the family war began, she believed powerful people around Gabriel were dangerous. David could barely hear him anymore. His entire life had shifted in seconds. The poor village boy, the mechanic, the orphan, and the homeless old man he fed with his last 200 naira was his father. But the shock was only beginning, because the moment the funeral ended, another convoy arrived. Black jeeps, armed escorts, and stepping out from the lead vehicle was a tall man in an expensive black agbada, cold eyes, sharp jawline, controlled anger. Barrister Tunde's face changed immediately. David, he said quietly, that is your uncle, Chief Gabriel's younger brother. Adewale Adebayo. The man walked toward them slowly while security surrounded him. People moved aside instantly. Power has a way of forcing space around itself. Adewale stopped before David and looked him over carefully. Not warmly. Not emotionally. Like a problem. So, he said coldly. The old man finally found his son. David said nothing. Adewale smiled faintly, but there was no kindness in it. You should be careful listening to stories from dead men. Barrister Tunde stepped forward immediately. This is neither the time nor place. No, Adewale replied calmly. This is exactly the place. Then his eyes returned to David. Because if you think inheriting his name means inheriting his empire, he leaned closer slightly. You have no idea what kind of war you are entering. Then he walked away. That night David could not sleep. He sat alone inside the tiny room and, ugly staring at the documents spread across his bed. Photographs, DNA reports, property papers, and one final sealed letter written by Gabriel himself. David opened it carefully. My son, if you are reading this, then I no longer have the courage to tell you these things myself. First, forgive me, not for being poor when you met me, but for being absent your entire life. I stayed away because I believed my enemies would destroy anyone connected to me. I watched your life from a distance more times than you know. Your mother protected you well. But when I met you again by accident on that rainy night, I realized something painful. You became the kind of man I should have been. Kind, honest, good, even when you had nothing. Especially when you had nothing. David stopped reading for a moment, tears finally escaping down his face. The letter continued. Everything they stole from me can return. Money returns. Power returns. But character does not. And you, my son, are worth more than every empire they fought over. There is one final thing you must know. The people who destroyed me are not finished. Be careful who smiles at you now, because many of them helped bury me while I was still alive. By morning, David made his decision. He would not run. Not anymore. The poor village boy everyone overlooked walked into Banana Island 3 days later wearing his only good shirt and carrying the same black nylon bag he arrived, Lagos with 2 years earlier. Security guards stared at him strangely outside the massive Adebayo mansion, until Barrister Tunde arrived personally to welcome him inside. And when the gates opened, David understood for the first time how enormous his father's world truly was. Luxury cars, marble fountains, security teams, portraits of generations worth more money than entire villages. And somewhere inside that same world were the people who destroyed his father, waiting, watching, smiling. The family meeting that evening felt less like grief and more like strategy. Everyone spoke politely. Too politely. Aunts who suddenly cared about him. Cousins pretending warmth. Executives shaking his hand too firmly. Predators studying a new arrival. But David had learned something important from poverty. When you grow up with nothing, you become very good at recognizing fake kindness. Then came the final shock. Barrister Tunda stood before the room and opened Gabriel's final will. The mansion fell silent, and as the lawyer began reading, faces slowly changed. Shock, fear, anger. Because Chief Gabriel Adebayo had left almost everything. To David, the poor village boy nobody saw coming. And at that exact moment, David realized something terrifying. His father did not leave him an inheritance. He left him a battlefield. Some people are born into power. Others are thrown into it by pain. David fed a homeless man because he believed kindness still mattered in a world that had stopped caring. And in the end, that kindness revealed a truth powerful enough to change his life forever. But perhaps the greatest lesson was this. Never underestimate people simply because they appear broken. Some carry kingdoms inside them while the world sees only dust. This has been Royal Village Tales. And tell us in the comments, do you think David should fight for his father's empire? Or walk away before the family destroys him too? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next emotional story where secrets, power, and survival collide.